Just a stunning moment today. Some 350 newspapers from coast to coast in this country, in big cities and small, standing up to President Trump's attacks, each writing editorials, most, though not all, denouncing the president's anti-media message. Here are just some of the headlines. Stop the war on a free press, that in the Philadelphia Inquirer. From Nebraska's Fall City Journal, we are not the enemy, we are your peers, friends, and neighbors. And this from the Topeka Capital Journal in Kansas. The press isn't the enemy of the people. Today on Twitter, the president fired back, attacking the Boston Globe for leading the charge on these op-eds. He also wrote this, quote, "There is nothing that I would want more for our country than true freedom of the press. The fact is that the press is free to write and say anything it wants, but much of what it says is fake news, pushing a political agenda, or just plain trying to hurt people. Honesty wins." Joining me tonight, retired ABC News correspondent and anchor Sam Donaldson, who spent a lot of time in the White House briefing room, most memorably confronting President Ronald Reagan. Sam, thanks so much for joining us tonight. You have the advantage of having covered administrations, Republican and Democrat, some of them not particularly fond of the media, including going back to Richard Nixon. But I want to ask you, what we're seeing and hearing today from President Trump, have you ever seen anything like it? Anything to that degree?
No. Richard Nixon, of course, hated the press. His press secretary, Ron Ziegler, hated the press, but it didn't do him any good. I mean, Jim, if you look at it, no one likes to be criticized. I don't. And no president, of course, wants to be told that he's doing something wrong. But most of them understand that's our job. And most of them, particularly people like Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, and even Bill Clinton during the Monica emergency, understood why we were there and why we were asking the questions that we did.
Does it worry you when you see some of that feeling that the president expresses seeping through to significant portions of the American public? There was a poll recently that 51% of Republicans agree that the press is the enemy of the people. Is that a danger to the country?
Well, it's a danger if I thought that most Americans thought that, or even some of them who go along with Donald J. Trump at the moment are going to think that forever. I don't believe that, not for a moment. Beating the press does not work. John Kennedy got so upset at David Halberstam, the New York Times reporter in Saigon during the early part of the Vietnam War, he wanted him fired. He didn't get fired. Lyndon Johnson was so upset about all of the press that started beating up on him because of Vietnam later in his presidency. Vietnam turned out the way it did. Richard Nixon, of course, left town one step ahead of the sheriff. It's the facts that matter, not what I say or any reporter or the press. It's the facts and the truth. And the American public, eventually, the large part of it, if it doesn't already, will come to know what the facts and truth are about Donald J. Trump, and they'll act accordingly.
Powerful words. I want to read, if I can, a portion from a Washington Post op-ed published just yesterday. This by Patty Davis, of course, the daughter of the late President Ronald Reagan, who you, of course, covered. And she said the following, I'm quoting here, "The verbal sparring between my father and Sam Donaldson of ABC or Helen Thomas of UPI is well documented, but there was never vitriol, there was never name-calling, and if anyone had attacked a journalist, my father would have been the first to stand in the way." You knew and covered Ronald Reagan very closely. Do you agree with that? What would he say if he saw and heard what President Trump is saying?
Well, Ronald Reagan was sure of himself. He was happy with himself. And he knew what he said or didn't say was what he wanted to do, and let the devil take the hindmost. And he never yelled or screamed or said anything, no expletive degree at the reporter that I ever heard of. For instance, one time Sarah McClendon, very aggressive, she was in the wax in World War II, started in on him, said, "You did this, you did that." And he replied by saying, "Sarah, how can you say that about such a sweet fellow as me?" And it broke the room up. And one time, early in his presidency, when we were in deep recession, I said, "Mr. President, tonight you blamed this continuing recession on Congress and the mistakes of the past. Doesn't any of the blame belong to you?" He replied, "Yes. Many years I was a Democrat." And we all sat down laughing. I mean, he could handle me, Helen, questions, and he did.
Sam Donaldson, always great to get your wise perspective.
Well, Jim, it's a pleasure to have been with you. Thank you.